Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Revit MEP webcast. My name is Don Rasmussen. I'm the Senior MEP Applications Engineer here at CTC, and today we're going to be covering fabrication in Revit. First off, guys, I have to apologize to those of you who signed up for the live webinar presentation this afternoon. We experienced some technical difficulties and we were unable to do a live broadcast. But we're posting this video, as you can see, now on our YouTube page. And please feel free to ask any questions in the comment field below, and we will respond to that in kind. So just again, once extending our sincerest apologies for the technical difficulties earlier today. So what are we going to cover today in this Fabrication in Revit webinar? Well, we are going to cover some RIF file exports, some ITM content and how that's actually used inside of Revit. There's a lot of confusion as to what type of format the content is in, the fabrication content that is. And then we're going to cover some MAJ file workflows that exist inside of Revit. So we're going to hit on all these topics, and we get a lot of questions about the fabrication in Revit. The fabrication in Revit is relatively new. It was introduced in 2016 and vastly improved on in 2017. And it's something that we see Autodesk paying a lot of attention to moving forward. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into one of my data sets here and go ahead and play around with some of these tools from Revit. Now, the first one that we're going to play around with are going to be the RIF file exports. And they exist right here in the RME to Fab workflow. This RME to Fab workflow is something that you won't have on your Revit add-ins ribbon unless you have Revit and the fabrication suite of tools installed from Autodesk. Once those things are installed, you will go ahead and you'll get these options. One thing that we have to note, however, is that Revit must be installed first and the Fab must be installed second in order for this to auto-populate. If you did it in the opposite order, we can still get these tools in here, but I would recommend contacting us here at CTC to help you through that process. It's doable, but it's not simple. However, this RIF file process is pretty darn simple. You would take basically your Revit design here, so your completed Revit design. You can highlight this entire design, like so. Then come to your filter tools. And basically we've got two levels of exports that we have to do. We have to do design line exports and element exports. Now, if I'm going to do a design line export like I'm doing right now, I have to keep in mind that all this export on this RIF file has to be mapped inside of Fabrication CAD, which we'll get to in just a moment. But it also means that as I create this design line export, that I need to take off things like mechanical equipment, air terminals, and perhaps even flex duct if I don't have that mapped into my services inside of Fabrication CAD MEP. So I'll keep these settings as is right here, and I'll just click OK. You see it keeps my selection here. Then I'm able to go to my add-ins tools and store that as design line elements. Then I'm going to make this same selection, but when I go into my filter tool, I'm going to make the opposite decisions here to turn things off. So I'm going to keep my flex duct, my mechanical equipment, and my air terminals on. And I'm going to store those in my add-ins tab as graphic elements. And then when I'm all done with that, I can go ahead and export that out. I'm going to go ahead and overwrite the file that I was playing with earlier here today and click Save. Yes, I want to replace that. Now that that RIF file has been exported, I can go to Fabrication CAD MEP. And the command to bring in that RIF file export is process run. When you run that, then we'll go ahead and navigate to where that file is. Oh, sorry guys. Back one, there we go. And there it is. Then what we have to do is click open. Now, upon opening this, you'll see that you've got some mapping dialog already, or a dialog box rather, in front of you right now. I have been playing with this workflow in preparation for this webinar, so all this mapping has been done. But unless this mapping has been established, you have to sit down and individually map these things together. And that mapping would look something similar to this. So we would come in here, we would right click on this service, we call it edit, and then we would be able to set what the service name was, what the specification was, be it 2 inches of water column, negative 2 inches of water column, welded black iron, galvanized. You can see there's other disciplines down here as well, and then whether we're going to ignore it or not. This would have to be set for every individual piece. However, we can do group selects here like this, and we can map everything together. Mapping things together is an integral part in this workflow, and you can imagine what this might look like if it was an entire job all done at once. So recommendation from CTC is to do this by level or do this in manageable chunks rather than doing the entire thing in one shot. You'll also notice down here that we can save this mapping once it's been completed. That's a nice useful tool. However, I find this to be very project specific, and so the benefits of saving this mapping may not extend to the next project. Then also something that we always forget is fittings ignores right here. A lot of people forget this step in this workflow. If you scroll down here a little bit more, I'll have my fittings ignore set to yes for all these other types of fittings because they're included as parts of my service, except for something that's in line like a damper. A damper will always want to set to no unless that's part of our service, otherwise it won't auto-populate. So we'll go ahead and click OK. And there we have our export. Now this is that RIF file again that came in, and basically what it does is it creates a design line, and this design line basically populates based upon three things: the route of the line, and then the size of the duct, and then whether it's rectangular or round. That's really all it's looking at as far as populating this with parts. And so you see here that it's not an exact export right now. We're missing some connections here to some pieces of equipment. We're missing some duct connections. For the most part, everything came in, and it came in pretty well. But there are some things that were lacking. You can see here, even though I turned off my flex duct, we've run into a bit of an issue here where it's extended some things and it's added flex duct in a different area. One thing that is nice though is it does add your hangers for you based upon rules that you set up. So you see I have hangers populating here. I did not have any hangers inside of my Revit model. And we are, for most of the parts we're doing pretty good. We can go ahead, and this is a usable file in the fabrication world. It's not perfect. We'll have to go through and do some coordination, if you will, because the fab parts have changed from the Revit parts, which may alter the design. And you can see that it's not 100% perfect as far as a complete repeat or complete plug-in of parts. As you can see, we have another issue here. But the point is that we don't have to erase that Revit file or throw it away and not use it, or use it just as a simple design guide as a contractor. We're trying to kind of plug that gap moving forward, making this collaboration quite a bit more useful rather than just restarting and reinventing the wheel, if you will, in our design. And so that's the RIF file export. As you guys see there, it's very simple, very quick, and it can save you a pretty significant chunk of time. Now I want to shift gears a little bit and move on to Revit 2017. And if we move on to Revit 2017 here, I'll go ahead and expand this. This is in 17. In 17, I've got the fabrication parts in Revit turned on. And if you're looking for the fabrication parts in Revit, if you go into your Systems tab, here's your fabrication parts that showed up in 16 and 17, and toggling this on and off just simply turns on and off your tool palette. Now, when you have this tool palette established, in order to do this, you'll have to pick different services that will populate this palette, along with different groups that go along with this palette as well. All those things will have to be pre-selected before your palette will populate with parts. If you struggle through that process, please give us a call here at CTC and we'll help you along with that. But it's a pretty simple process, and there's lots of good stuff on Google out there to help you through that process as well if you're struggling. So in 2016, in essence, what we were able to get out of the fabrication portfolio in Revit 2016 was the save of an export and the RIF file. We were able to finally use these fabrication parts, inside of Revit 2016. But in Revit 2017, they took a huge jump forward. And we're going to go over some of those workflows that have changed from 16 to 17 and how you may be able to benefit from them. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick a run right here. I'm going to go ahead and click on this elbow. Now, this is a Revit elbow. It's RFA content, as you see over here, right? When I click on this elbow, you'll notice in my contextual tab that I have some different options that I didn't really have before. Mostly this design to fabrication tool. As soon as I click on this design to fabrication tool, it's going to ask me to pick a service. In this case, it's going to be +2 inches of water column. Click OK, and then it will go ahead and replace that part with a fabricatable duct elbow, as well as a chunk of ductwork, a 10-foot chunk of ductwork here, because it understands that fabricating parts are connecting. But now here's a couple things that I want you guys to keep in mind. These pieces here are fabricatable pieces, so that makes them ITM content. And ITM content used to solely live inside of the fabrication suite, but now we're introducing it into Revit. But what it does mean is that these aren't RFA families. They aren't going to have the amount of parameters that you would like. You're not going to be able to input even your own parameters. Here we have a more parameters edit part, and we'll explore that a little bit. You see most of this is grayed out, and we can't adjust most any of this at all. This is what's showing us our connectors, be it connector 1 or connector 2 here in the photo. And dimensions are what they are. We don't get to edit them here. So there will be no editing of these parts inside of Revit. The editing of these parts would have to be done inside of the fabrication suite of tools from Autodesk. But since we were able to really quickly and easily replace that part, we are able to add on to this part as well. You'll see there's also an edit part here tool, or edit part tool here. Basically opens the same dialog box that we saw with the straight duct, and not able to change anything, just basically verify some of the data that's included with the part. One thing that's really nice about this fabrication suite here too is that we can lay out chunks of ductwork, and they understand their connectivity to each other. They'll lay right here in line, just like this. If we want to go ahead and let's see here, let me put an elbow on there on that side. And the fabrication parts come with some really nifty tools as well. So if I click on this elbow, I got the ability to stretch that joint, which is a really nice feature. I also have the ability to rotate that elbow. You can rotate it in 90-degree increments, up, down, left, or right. Flip it, back and forth. So we have some fabrication content in here that's really, really good. But I'd like to direct your attention to this piece of ductwork right here. And so if I go ahead and I click on this piece of ductwork, you'll see that I have 275 CFM of flow through this piece of ductwork. When I come over here and click on the fabrication piece of ductwork and I look for something, a parameter for CFM rather, I don't see it, simply because it doesn't exist, and I'm not able to put that parameter in there. So, and therein lies the difference really between RFA and ITM content. ITM content is going to have to be manipulated with the fabrication suite of tools inside of FabCAD MEP. It is not going to be able to propagate flow for you in Revit. You're not going to be able to add additional parameters for scheduling and things like that. However, in 2017, Autodesk did take the time to add some parameters for us to make things like scheduling and tagging much easier. But the ITM content is, just because it's available for us in Revit doesn't mean it has all the functionality of RFA file. It's actually quite limited in the Revit environment from an analytics standpoint. Hopefully this keeps growing and we get the ability to do some of that, some of the analytics with it here inside of the Revit environment. But that all remains to be seen to see if we're going to get some of those opportunities with some of this fabrication content. So we have the design to fabrication tool. So if I go ahead and click on this fitting, say for example I have design to fabrication, again just go ahead and swap parts out. If there aren't parts loaded, it will not be able to convert them. Okay. Notice that there's not a cannot continue warning, but I also don't have that part here inside of my service, so there's nothing for it to really choose from, which is why it didn't populate. That actually brings up a really good point about where do you get some of these parts if they aren't inside your fab library, and maybe you want to play with this. Revit 2017 was shipped with some fab libraries already stored inside of it. So in 2017 Revit, you can play with a lot of these new features. In 2016, however, you would have to go to building3dcontent.com in order to access the entire fab database from Autodesk. It's all up there for you to download and use. Then you would have to, if you don't have fab on your computer, install a trial of the fabrication software to be able to load the fabrication parts into Revit for you to use in 2016. But some of these other options that we have with some of these fab tools are actually quite nice. You can see that we can do stretches of certain things, so I'm going to come out and I'm going to grab this. Actually, let's tab through here so it can select the entire thing, and we'll just move this guy off into space so we can look at that thing independently here. So now when we have this off into space, I'm going to go ahead and grab it and stretch it here a little bit, and you'll see that it just allows me to simply stretch my piece of ductwork. If I come back to that piece of ductwork, I have this optimize lengths option, which will go through and fill in my lengths for me, or every single joint that I have inside of my duct run, which is a pretty nice feature inside of Revit, something that's very usable from a fabrication perspective as well. And then also the ability to attach, like I showed earlier, the ability to attach certain things. So if I attach, this takeoff here, rather I can flip this in all sorts of different directions and add joints to it as well, as you see there. So it's very customizable, very friendly user interface. So then I have something like the route and fill tool. In order to do the route and fill tool, I'm going to go ahead and make some selections here. I'm going to just copy those over. And then I'm going to come back to this open side, take advantage of the route and fill, go from that point to that point, and you can see your options there. You can toggle through your options here as well, be it a mitered elbow or a rectangular elbow. So lots of good options that you have here inside of the route and fill tool. As you can see, it actually works pretty well compared to some of the other auto route tools that have been offered inside of Revit. So now let's go ahead and cover the Fabrication MAJ export and bringing that into Revit to provide that .rvt file extension deliverable that a lot of people are asking for. Here I am inside of Fabrication CAD MEP, and create cam is going to be the command that we want to run. So I'll go ahead and run that command. I'll do a group select of everything. Now it's important to note that this MAJ export is just going to take things that have been populated by a design line. All those graphical elements we did with the RIF export, then none of those are going to come over. That we're going to have to populate either inside of Revit with fab pieces or with Revit content. But I'll have all these selected. I'll hit enter. It'll create this MAJ file export for me. I'm going to go ahead and overwrite this webinar one. Yes, I'd like to overwrite that. And then I'll go ahead and open up Revit again. Now here we are in Revit. This has to be imported into a clean drawing according to Autodesk. I have gotten this to work in a non-clean drawing, but that does lead to some confusion as to which parts are which. So I would recommend bringing it into a clean drawing just because I think it's quite a bit easier to do that. Then I'm back to my add-ins tab, go into my import, and I'm going to import my Autodesk fabrication job. I'm going to go ahead and pick my service, which will be my Imperial Content Library. Click OK, and it will want me to navigate to my MAJ file. I'll do that, and we'll watch it process here for a moment. And we see here it's imported. Now we'll click OK here so we can take a peek at it. And we'll see that it did a great job of bringing in all the design line pieces, and it did it piece by piece. So in the areas where it was broken down and there was some issues, those issues are still there because we didn't take any time inside of fabrication to go ahead and fix a lot of these issues. But that's the export there. You can see it works really well, and it does allow you to kind of bridge those gaps between contracting and engineering in some ways. It may not be exactly where we want it yet or where a lot of people want it yet, but it does provide us with a lot of different options that we can take away. We're no longer just completely disregarding each other's work for our own. So the ability here to use the Revit file post-design is becoming greater and greater as this workflow advances from Autodesk. So let's go ahead and review a little bit. Let's step back to our slideshow here for a moment, and we'll review a little bit about the RME to Fab exports. Now, those RME to Fab exports, they were first made available to us in 2013. So if you had the Fab and Revit back in 2013, you had access to these RME to Fab exports. There are two methods of the export, like we went over. There's the design line elements and then the graphic elements that are going to need to be stored, and they'll be independent. As mentioned earlier, you must install Revit before the Fabrication CAD in order to get these parts. And how this actually works, and this is an actual quote from the Autodesk training video, is that the raw geometry of the exported Revit element is used to create Fabrication CAD MEP items, and that's how the connectors are supposed to go into the right locations. As we saw during the webinar, that didn't happen every single time, but it did happen 99% of the time. That was extremely accurate. Obviously with sheet metal there's always going to be a little bit of a hang-up simply because sheet metal can be so customized. With pipes it does tend to go a little bit easier. And then the fabrication library in Revit. It's important to understand that there's ITM content and RFA content like we discussed in the webinar as well. But the ITM content in 2016, it won't run Revit Analytics like we discussed, and we can't add parameters. That's both true in 16 and 17 as well. It doesn't transfer data between any RFA to ITM content. And in 2016, scheduling and tagging was pretty difficult. In 2017, Autodesk added a bunch of parameters for us. We still can't add our own, but we do gain the ability to schedule and tag relatively easily. The route and fill tool, along with some other options that I showed you inside of the webinar for the fabrication parts, are very valid, and they work great. In fact, some of us here at CTC we're kind of hoping that they might make some of these tools available for RFA content because we like them that much. So we're keeping our fingers crossed for that. And you are able to do some parts. I wasn't able to click on some of that throughout the webinar, but there is a very limited amount of part editing that can be done inside of Revit with these parts. So with that, guys, I hope you enjoyed the webinar. Once again, my name is Don, and I work here at CTC. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to contact us here. There's the phone number. And as always, we offer free support on anything to anyone. So go ahead and give us a call if you run into any problems with any of your Autodesk software. We'll be more than glad to help you. So thanks, guys, for attending the webinar, and have a great day.